Nope.
Hello, dear listener, and thank you for joining me in this week's video. This one is a little graphic, so listener discretion advised. You've been warned. With that said, let's dive right in to 22 twisted torture methods in history. Number 1. The Heretics Fork. The Heretics Fork was a special torture device used in the Middle Ages against those who spoke out against the Catholic Church. With two spiked ends, this device was attached to the victim's neck and was only removed after the victim spoke the words, "I recant." Number 2. The Judas Cradle. In medieval times, the Judas Cradle was among the most disturbing torture methods. Victims would be hoisted above a pyramid-like device and forcibly lowered onto the tip. Number 3. Rat torture. This method was popular in both medieval Germany and ancient China. A pot of hungry rats would be placed against the belly of the victim. As the pot was slowly heated, the distressed rats would gnaw through anything in their way. And seeing as the victim's flesh was softer than the metal, you can do the math. Number 4. The Brazen Bull. Legend has it that during the 6th century BC, a brass worker in Athens named Perillus designed what is arguably the most sadistic torture method to date, the Brazen Bull. In this device, the victim would be placed inside a hollowed-out brass bowl with fire lit underneath. A system of tubes inside the statue would then amplify the victim's screams to sound like a raging bull. Are you ready for the oh-so-fun irony in all of this? The ruler at the time, a man by the name of Perillus, discovered the device and was so disgusted by it that he decided to use it on Perillus. Yes, that Perillus, the one who designed the damn thing to begin with. Number 5. The Iron Maiden. Associated predominantly with the Inquisition, the Iron Maiden was a coffin-like device that was lined on the inside with spikes. The victim would be placed inside the chamber, and the executioner would close the door behind them. Number 6. Ling Qi. Otherwise known as the Death of 1,000 Cuts, Ling Qi rose to popularity during the 14th century Ming dynasty. It was reserved for the most severe of crimes and was characterized as the slow and methodical slicing of the body over a long period of time. Number 7. The Breast Ripper. The breast ripper was a terrifying instrument used in medieval Germany to rip off the breasts of women. It was usually heated or frozen first, then clamped onto the woman's breast to be yanked away. Ugh, that's f***ed up. Number 8. The Rack. The rack is easily one of the most recognizable torture devices from medieval Europe. The victim would have their ankles and wrists tied to the device, while two executioners cranked the rack's gears. Slowly, this machine would pull the victim's limbs in opposite directions until they were eventually dismembered. Number 9. Premature Burial. This one is somewhat self-explanatory. The victims are buried alive, usually with some form of coffin. One of the latest documented cases was during the Nanking Massacre in 1937, when Japanese troops buried Chinese civilians alive. Number 10. The Breaking Wheel. With this medieval device, the victim is tied to a large rotating wheel as the executioner takes swings at them with a gigantic iron hammer. This gruesome display was considered entertainment for the townsfolk to gather and watch. Number 11. The tub. Known as the punishment of sitting in the tub, the convicted person would be placed in a wooden tub with only their head sticking out. After that, the executioner would paint their faces with milk and honey. Soon, flies would begin to feed on them. The victim was also fed quite regularly, and would end up swimming in their own excrement. After a few days, maggots and worms would devour their body as they decayed alive. Number 12. Flaying. This was the widespread practice of removing the skin from a still living body. Generally, an attempt is made to keep the removed portion of the skin intact. Records show that the actual flaying process might begin at various places in the body, such as the lower leg or thighs. Typically, the cause of death during this process were shock, critical blood loss or other bodily fluids, hypothermia, or infections. The actual death is estimated to occur from a few hours up to a few days after the process begins. Number 13. Impalement. Given his name, it should come to no surprise that the most favored method of execution by Vlad the Impaler was in fact impalement. In 15th century Romania, the victim was forced to sit on a sharp and thick pole. When the pole was then raised upright, the victim was left to slide down the pole with their own weight. It could take the victim up to 3 days to die using this method. Legend has it that Vlad the Impaler once did this to 20,000 people, all while enjoying a meal. Number 14. The lead sprinkler. Usually filled with molten lead, tar, boiling water, or boiling oil, it was used to torture victims by dripping the contents onto their stomach or other body parts such as the eyes or mouth. Using this device, the torturer would proceed to pour the molten silver on the victim's eyes, which resulted in agonizing pain and eventually death. Number 15. Boiling alive. During this process, a victim would either be placed in a vat of boiling liquid or a vat of cold liquid which was then heated to boil. The liquid could be oil, acid, tar, water, or molten lead. During the reign of King Henry VIII, it was a punishment especially reserved for people who utilized poison to kill their victims. Number 16. Coffin Torture. The most preferred torture method in the Middle Ages was known as coffin torture. This method involved placing the victim inside a metal cage roughly the size of the human body, hence the name. The torturers also forced overweight victims into smaller cages to heighten their discomfort as they swung from a tree or gallows. Generally, they would be left there until the crows came to feed on their remains. Number 17. Cement shoes. The cement shoes were introduced by the American Mafia when they executed enemies, traitors, or spies by placing their feet inside cinder blocks and then filling them up with wet cement. Once it dried, the victim would be thrown alive into a river or other deep body of water. Number 18. Keelhauling. During this process, a sailor would be tied to a line that looped beneath the vessel, thrown overboard on one side of the ship, and dragged underneath the ship's keel, either from one side of the ship to the other or the length of the ship from bow to stern. Since the hull of the ship was usually covered in sharp barnacles or other marine growth, keel hauling would typically result in serious cuts, loss of limbs, or even decapitation. If the victim was dragged slowly, His weight might lower him sufficiently to miss the barnacles, but this method would frequently result in drowning. Number 19. The Spanish Donkey. This torture device, used during the Spanish Inquisition, required the victim to be put astride, naked, on a donkey-like apparatus, which is actually a vertical wooden board with a sharp V-wedge on top of it. Once they were up there, the torturer would add varying weights to the victim's feet, until the wedge finally sliced through the victim's body. Number 20. The Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a torture device used in the Middle Ages as a way to torture liars, blasphemers, homosexuals, women accused of witchcraft, and those who conducted a miscarriage. It involved a pear-shaped instrument being inserted into one of the victim's orifices. I'm not going to go into detail, but you can use your imagination. The instrument consisted of 4 leaves that separated from each other when the torturer slowly turned the screw at the top. The torturer will decide if he wants to simply tear the skin or expand the pear to its maximum and mutilate the victim. Number 21. The Spanish Tickler. Also known as the cat's paw, this type of torture instrument consists of a long, sharp set of iron spikes, curved so that it resembles claws. It was often attached to a handle, sometimes used as an extension of the torturer's hand. It was used to rip and tear flesh away from the bone, from any part of the body. This torture device was commonly used on thieves and unfaithful wives. Most who were tortured in this manner didn't die right away, but afterwards. This device would cause infections, as the device would cut deep, and since they weren't often sanitized, the risk of infections were very high. Number 22. Scafism. Also known as the boats, this was an ancient Persian method of execution. This method would involve the victim being firmly fastened within the interior of 2 narrow rowing boats. They were joined together one on top of another, with the head, hands, and feet of the victim sticking out. They were then forced to ingest milk and honey to the point of developing severe diarrhea, and more honey would be poured on top of them to attract insects, with special attention devoted to the eyes, ears, mouth, and face. He would then be left to float on a stagnant pond or be exposed to the sun. Death, when it eventually occurred, was due to a combination of dehydration. Delirium would set in after a few days, making the victim's final moments even worse than you can imagine. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, be sure to smack that like button down below, or I will put you in the Iron Maiden.
Iron Maiden? Excellent!
I'm just kidding, you know I love you. But if you did enjoy this video and haven't subscribed already, I would love for you to join the channel, hit that subscribe button, and if you want to hit that little bell so you can be notified whenever there's a new upload, that would be awesome too. And due to the theme of this video, if you guys want to leave a comment below letting me know which one of the 22 methods grossed you out the most and made you cringe the most, that would be an interesting discussion. For me, it's definitely either the breast ripper or the Pear of Anguish, because what the hell? That's pretty messed up. Guys, if you didn't see the update video I posted last Thursday, I just want to let you know that the first episode of the Nope Too Creepy podcast is up and running. I will leave a link in the description down below. The announcement video has a little bit more detail, but to quickly summarize, each episode of the podcast will feature 2 to 3 stories in a themed manner. and they're all stories that have been featured on this channel before. And just to reiterate, no new stories will ever be featured on the podcast. New content will always be uploaded to the channel first, so don't worry about that if you're not interested in the podcast. I mainly made it to attract new listeners, so if you listen exclusively on YouTube, no need to worry about that. But if you want to hear the stories in a newer, different format, the podcast is there. My goal is to get it on iTunes, maybe even Spotify before Halloween, so fingers crossed. With that said, everybody, remember to stay safe out there. I'll be seeing you in the next video.